Thank you, Tenzi, and the Center for Sustainable Business for bringing us together here today. Paul and I are delighted to be in conversation with you. We were just talking a few minutes ago. I think there's over 1,000 people listening in. And of course, those of you who are listening, are representing and holding space for so many who are looking for this moment in time as an opportunity to reimagine what's possible. And as we're talking about real lives, real livelihoods, and a planet that we know is in trouble, but that here in the time of COVID, it's been a defining moment, a transformational moment. And as Paul and I think and talk it a lot around Imagine, that brings together the interconnectivity of our systems and how we can't have unhealthy people on an unhealthy planet. So that's our conversation that we're in today with us. Paul, is there anything you'd like to say to tee up the conversation? And I know you're going to come.
I love what Tenzi is doing with the Center for Sustainable Business. It's just a wonderful idea and so practical. You know, how can we work together to build the business case for sustainability? We all know what we need to do, but it's more about the how now. And I'm so happy to see that the 2 days and the work of the university itself is really entirely focusing on the how. And I'm sure that the panel that you will capably lead will get to that as well. And hopefully the audience will pick up a few useful tips as we try to accelerate this transformation that we all know is desperately needed.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I think you and I were talking a bit backstage before we got on, but when we were first envisioning the kind of space for Imagine, I think we were envisioning what we were going to be listening to today here in this conversation, right? That you've got to bring together human beings whose names we know, who are in powerful positions of business leadership, like we're going to hear from Angela, former CEO of Burberry and former SVP of Apple Retail. And who's been working as part of our CEO circle of alumni CEOs like yourself, Paul. And Geraldine, who's just joined us as well, the co-CEO of DSM, who joined us as part of the Food Collective as we were bringing it together. Good to see you, Geraldine.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. It's great to be part of this conversation with an amazing audience. So looking forward to an energetic debate.
Yeah. We'll have it for sure. And I think we're also going to be joined by Patrice Louvet, who I know, Paul, you've known for many years in many different worlds. I think he might have worked together at some point before he became CEO of Ralph Lauren. And I remember sitting with Patrice in Davos, listening to you, Paul, as you were talking about for representing the Saïd Business School. And we were talking about how we need the new moral leadership and courageous leadership in business to be then taking roles like Geraldine and Angela and Patrice have now, and thinking about the world in different ways. And Patrice and I were sitting there talking about how what you had stood for, Paul, and kind of what the work that you had led at Unilever, and now what we've created space for together with Imagine, for courageous leaders to step in, act bigger than their system of their company together. Patrice was joining me and saying, Paul's helped set the standard, but now it's up to many of us to step into that kind of leadership. So.
Well, that's kind of him, but both Geraldine and Patrice and Angela, as you will see in a minute, are leaders that you all aspire to be. So I look forward to the panel. I think Patrice might have a little bit of a problem getting in. I see that here on the site, that there seems to be a technical issue or something.
Possibly.
I don't know if they can hear us, but it's probably better if Angela and Patrice come in at the same time. Then you can get going.
Yeah. Well, so we've said, I think anybody who's listening in has experienced the tech difficulties that it is today, right? We're all zooming in from around the world as well.
We've become more tolerant, that's for sure. Here we are.
Hi, Angela. Zooming in from the West Coast, very early for you, right? In the US. Yeah, good to see you. And Paul's with us from London, where he's there to hold space and hopefully get the vaccine soon. Geraldine, you're calling in from Switzerland, is that right? Yeah. And in between that, Holland, and Patrice should be coming in a moment. He's coming in from New York. So it's a global conversation as we're in, as members of Tribe Humanity, and the people listening in as well can do. Angela, why did you say yes to getting up early with us while we're waiting on Patrice to join us?
Well, Valerie, if this is early, then I don't know what I've done. This was actually the perfect time. And I think it's the perfect forum because I think you've put a great diverse panel together. I think we all look at this opportunity and this moment to share our different perspectives. And it is across the entire end-to-end value chain. And I've had the luxury of working on each end of it. I'm now on the receiving end of all of our irresponsibility over the years. So it's an honor to share with you.
Yeah, thanks for that. When you say you've been on the receiving end, do you mean because of your new role as the chair of Save the Children that you stepped into?
Sure.
Yeah.
It's different when you're running a company and you hear about, and you're doing wonderful things at Burberry, at Apple, wonderful programs, and you hear about the devastation, you read about it. But now, at this next chapter of my life, as I'm witnessing it and just layer COVID on top of it, I mean, the devastation due to climate is real. And the hundreds of millions of people from food deprivation to migration and so, I'm honored to be on the other end. And I'm going to hope that I can use my experience and partner back with, because none of us can fix any of this on our own. We each have to play a role in each stage of business life, et cetera.
Well said. And I think that's where when Paul and I were holding the space for Imagine, we were saying that right there, none of us can do this on our own. And it takes people either by yourself who, like yourself, who have been in business roles now transitioning to say, okay, I'm going to hold space in the private sector or in the civil society or governments, or like as Geraldine, I think, can also speak to the roles that we're playing now of people in CEO and business leadership positions who are acting bigger than your company to help to shift the whole system as well. So, Paul, I think if you want to step out, I think you're going to listen in on the conversation, and Patrice will join us. You're more than welcome to stay as a part of the conversation, but I know Patrice should be coming in.
And I know that Patrice is trying to get in. There really are some issues there, so hopefully he gets there. I'll leave you guys. Super. I'll talk later. I'll be back later. Thanks.
Yeah, we'll see you soon to listen in on that. Geraldine and Angela, let's start off with where we were just talking about the can't do it alone. Right? And when you think about the bottlenecks that you face as a CEO, Geraldine, as a food company, if you would call yourself that, and Angela, of course, when you were in your position at Burberry and then also in Apple, can you talk to us about what the challenges you face and how when you're held accountable and you want to help address some of the challenges you were just talking about, Angela, but you can't solve them yourself? Geraldine.
Would you like me to kick off? With pleasure. And first, I would like to say hi to everyone listening. I have to sort of say a little something about myself because it makes me very excited being part of this panel. Is that, as you know, Valerie, because you know me well, I'm actually a geographer and I study sustainable development. And therefore, I can fully associate with the audience here, and I fully support the founding principle of the CSB, which, if I read correctly, is that sustainable business is good business. And that is absolutely correct. And of course, I very much have been living this through my life. Wait, it's Patrice. That's good. Now, to answer your question on a little bit, why is collaboration so essential? Now, DSM, we are in the food system, so we're part of the food chain. We're sort of in the middle. We're neither upstream with the agricultural production, nor are we a consumer-facing company. We are actually the science and the innovation power behind nutrition and making things nutritious and environmentally sustainable. Now, what we found is that while there's a huge consumer pull now for not only products which are healthy and nutritious, but are also produced in a sustainable way for the planet, so healthy for the planet, as an industry, we're really struggling to make that wish happen. And for me, there's 4 things which are essential and that we can only achieve if we collaborate. So the first one is actually transparency. So you want to put something on a product that says this is good for you and is good for the planet. But how do you actually make that happen in reality from the field all the way to your doorstep or the consumer actually eating the product? So that transparency, super difficult to achieve, and yet absolutely essential. So that's one of the big barriers. The other barrier is actually commitment. Now, we all know that when you want to do things differently, you actually have to invest. You have to invest effort, education, technology, new equipment. So if I take an example, if we want the agricultural space to adopt different practices that avoid food waste or biodiversity issues, they need to do different. But at the same time, if there's no commitment that they will be recognized for their efforts, it's very difficult. Now, I'm just going to pause here for a second. I'm hearing an increasing amount of noise on the line.
I'm not sure. I think it looks like it's simmering down. It's not coming from Angela and Patrice's microphones, and it's not coming from mine. So I think we're go through as we can.
I hope it's not mine. I think it looks okay. So, so transparency, commitment. A third critical thing is belief. There's such a deep-rooted sense, particularly in the food system space, that everything takes time, that it's going to take forever to change. And yet, in the course of the year, to be fair, we change really fast. So that belief that we actually can do things quickly is something that we need each other to build. Otherwise, in isolation, we kind of go, not so sure we can do it and that fast. And lastly, we need to care. And we need to care about livelihoods. I mean, it's not good enough to only think about our piece of the value here, and we don't care what comes before or what comes after. We need to think about livelihoods across. So that's why I love what you do, Valerie. I love Imagine, because it puts us all in the room, and hopefully together we can kind of break down these 4 barriers or areas of opportunity, if you want to see it positively, to really speed up the change. So there you go.
Thanks for that, Geraldine, and thanks for being Imagine. We don't think of Imagine as an organization. We think of it as a movement and an idea whose time has come, and you are embodying it. And as I think you were saying, it's the belief first that we can change things quickly, the construct of the systems around us that we're now trying to reconstruct through transparency, through commitment, through caring, as you said on the heart on that, is possible when a few people act together greater than their own self-interest for the collective greater good, that we can't imagine it. Patrice, we have you back, finally. I'd love to come to you before we lose you again, if we can. I'm not sure, can you hear us, see us okay? Yeah, and now you just went on mute. Angela, I'm going to come to you. You're also on the board of Ralph Lauren, and I heard Patrice say you could also speak on behalf of what's happening there too. But I know while we're waiting to get his technology sorted, as we do, what comes up for you when you're listening to Geraldine talk about these challenges where you need the full value chain coming together and need to reimagine broader than your own kind of company perspective? Talk to us about that. And you can talk to us about how you saw compassion as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I started at Burberry in 2006, so it's a long time ago, but it was interesting because ESGs come so far from then. And in a lot of essence, you had to do it on your own. You didn't have a lot of things to follow, et cetera. But I think the most important thing, and I know we'll get further down to it, but I think there's so many then, and many companies still today that are laggards in this space. It's more of a box you tick versus embedded into your daily operating model, right? Mm-hmm. It's not it is just something that it has to be built into a company's DNA, being responsible. And so, for example, at Burberry, design had a role, the merchants had a role, the supply chain people had a role, but then we created the Burberry Foundation to put 1% of our profits to also continue further down, right? To help where we. And so, and I think like you said, Geraldine, it is good business. And I'll give you an example from Burberry. When I started, our largest handbag program, over 60% of the accessory business were made out of PVC. Not only was it the largest, it was the highest margin business. But it's PVC, the worst thing in the world for water, for the environment. And so it had to go away. We had to find something to replace it with. And we united the team. Everyone was on a mission. And in 3 years, that became zero, still became a huge, but we were able to, but there was a plan to do it, and we had to do it as a team together. And you had to do it with raw material suppliers who had to invest to innovate. You had to do it, I mean, all the way down the value chain. You can't do any of that in isolation. But I do think it starts with the leaders, to your point, Geraldine, uniting and believing that this is what they have to do. You know, we had a trench coat because I believe that it's not, I believe you have to make your product sustainably, but I also think you have to make sustainable products. So we said very early on, you have to make a trench coat and make a handbag to last 50 years. We encouraged people to send them back. We started Art of the Trench so you could show all the old ones you had in your closet. Then you could buy customized things to add on to it. So we wanted you to extend the life. We wanted you to drop it down to the next generation. This was long before resale or real or any of that. But we knew that making less and extending the life was also one of the most sustainable things we could do. So I think those are two lessons.
Yeah, well said. And I think the other thing that you say there is you shift the time horizon from a short term, make more, and let's do that, to then saying, okay, it's about a long horizon that we're doing. Things are sustainable within it. And then I think you were also on the forefront, as you said, of new business models that can then reimagine. So it's reuse, recycle, the circularity, all of that then as well, as that we're seeing in fashion. It was interesting to think about fashion as an industry, though, because you have companies and you've got to come together as a leadership team. You've got to then, as you say, incorporate your full supply chain. But there's at a certain point, and I know, Geraldine, you've been in a lot of these conversations as it relates to the food value chain, where you just can't do anything more as a company if you move together as an industry. And Patrice has joined us as well. He was one of the founding members of the Fashion Pact. And so when Paul and I were first launching Imagine with other people, we were saying part of the Better Business, Better World tribe, like many people listening in today, we said fashion as an industry, along with food, touches lives in a very profound way, but it also helps set the trend about what is sexy, what is unique, what the way that we make and take and eat, and as everything Angela was saying, make the long-lasting trench coat an attractive thing. Patrice, you were one of the founding members of the Fashion Pact, which was mobilizing an industry on big commitments. And now you're on the steering committee of that as well, in addition to the UN Global Compact and many other roles. Tell us about why you stepped into that leadership role and why you think the Fashion Pact and collective action like that is what's needed now.
Sure. Hi, Valerie, Geraldine, and Angela. Sorry for the technical difficulties. I'm glad to finally be able to join all of you, and I'm sorry I missed the first few minutes. Maybe first some grounding on how we think about this space for Ralph Lauren, because I think it's important to then understand what drives our actions.
Perfect.
And three things I would call out. First of all, our approach is really grounded in our purpose. Our purpose at Ralph Lauren is to inspire the dream of a better life through timelessness and authenticity. So timelessness is at the very heart of this company, has been from the beginning. And I heard Angela talk about, keeping a bag or a trench coat for 50 years. And Ralph would say exactly the same thing. We design products to be loved, to be worn for generations. So that's really the starting point. The second piece is, it's very clear today, and you probably touched on it earlier, that all of our stakeholders expect us to lead and to make an impact in this space, whether that's our consumers, our own employees. And I think this is now critical for recruiting and retention. Our investors, more and more in investor calls now, I get questions on what are we doing in the citizenship and sustainability front. Obviously, the communities we live in. And then many of our partners are setting as expectations, some of the pure players in Europe, for example, have very clear expectations on the type of products that we put on the market and how sustainable our overall supply chain is.
Yeah.
So we approach this through three simple principles. One is stewardship. We didn't inherit the planet from our parents. We actually are borrowing it from our children. And so we have an immense stewardship responsibility as we do that. The second is really integration, which is this is not something you can do as a separate effort with a small team over there. It's got to be part of all dimensions of the company. And I often talk about sustainability being like electricity, which it just needs to be everywhere. And to some extent, everyone has a role to play. And to some extent, some of it needs to happen without us even noticing it. And then the third point is impact, which I know Valerie and you and Paul care deeply about, right? The risk in this space is a long list of activities that makes all of us feel good that we're active, we're doing things. But fundamentally, that is useless if there is no clear impact on the different dimensions, whether that's people, planet, or the way products are developed. So that's how we think about it. I was very excited about the initiative that President Macron, in the context of G7, and I think, with Paul and you as the catalyst, set up with the Fashion Pact. Very unexpected, right? Because this is an industry about exclusivity and everyone kind of generally doing things by themselves. And here you have Kering, you have Chanel, you have PVH, you have Gap, a group that keeps growing. We had the steering committee yesterday, actually, and new members, want to join, which is a good sign of the health of an organization, as Paul, you mentioned. And I think we all realize that we have a significant effect on the planet as an industry, and we all want to make a difference. And we know that this is a business imperative. We know that this is a crisis. So there's a real sense of urgency that all of us need to have. And I think as we are working together, and it's been a little more than a year, as you mentioned, we've delineated very clear spaces: climate, biodiversity, oceans, with specific deliverables. And I'm encouraged by the progress we're making. We know this is a journey, but I'm encouraged by the way the group has come together. No one's really looking out for their own firm, and everyone comes in with a very generous mindset, I find, with the objective of really making a difference. So that's been the reason we want to be part of it, and so far I've been excited by the initial engagement, with obviously much more to do.
Yeah, thank you for that. I love how you started with the work that you're doing in the company, right, of Ralph Lauren, because as we would say, companies change industries, but we need the industries or the human beings who run them and the mindsets and the care they come from to shift the system. And so being able to be authentic and leading yourself, walking the talk, making the transformations, going for what's needed in the present day, but also designing new models for the future, while all holding space for the transformation across the industry. Geraldine, can I come to you from look at the analog between what was happening with what Patrice is talking about in Angela in fashion, with what you're also seeing in food. So there's something about you guys coming together across the value chain. And then what happened in the food space, I think you can talk to very well, is it isn't just business leaders coming together. What happens when you get a critical mass of industry together? Do you want to share a little bit about that as well, and the kind of broader partnership that opens up?
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. I mean, in the comments earlier, it was very much referring to how do we work end to end within an industry, just amongst the private sector players. But what we find, and particularly in the food system, food is about society. It involves so many livelihoods. It's everywhere. And you cannot shift everything through collaboration between private sector players. You also need to work with all of the stakeholders. And one of the things we've been thinking, and Valerie, very clearly, is how do you actually make the farmer the hero in all of this? I mean, if you're going to address some of the critical issues linked to climate, linked to food systems, is actually climate. A lot of you probably are aware on this call, being sustainability professionals and passionate people about sustainability, that about a third of greenhouse gases come from the agricultural space. Now, when that happens, you have to start thinking about brand new practices and really addressing biodiversity. We waste today 30% of the food is wasted. Now, you don't change fundamental system shifts. Sorry, there's kind of quite a noise on the line. I don't know. So I don't know if I should try and speak over it or not.
I think it's okay. Angela, Patrice, I think we can hear you. Some fundamental system shifts. And it's important what you're saying. So I think let's stay with it.
I'll keep going then. So in order to be able to truly change something like the food system, which, by the way, will be the most impacted by climate, you need to work with governments, And there's areas around subsidies, for example. There's clearly topics around taxation. There's topics around livelihoods. And one thing we've been looking at very practically is how can we ensure that farmers get more if they adopt more sustainable practices. And typically a price on carbon or on greenhouse gases would be extremely helpful, because whenever they make the effort to change their practices, then they get more income, and then you have a virtuous circle, which is really, really helpful. But the key word to do that is actually trust. I mean, one thing that is still a bit of a barrier is how do we, across stakeholder groups, work together as opposed to finger points. And in order to do that, you need to build partnerships, but you also very clearly need to be able to demonstrate that we will get together already as a sector in order to get this to happen. So that's the key things that we're seeing, is that to gain credibility and trust from the stakeholders along the value chain that we work in, which is the food system, you need to be also united and be held accountable. And Patrice, you said that very clearly. If we're not willing to be held accountable, why would anybody trust what we're saying? So these are at least some of the key learnings that I've picked up, over the years, but particularly recently.
Yeah. And I think if you look at what DSM was doing with African Improved Foods, and recently I was in Kenya and was looking at and talking to the woman who's leading the UN Food Summit, Agnes Kalabata, and we were talking about kind of models where you've seen that you can have this kind of multi-stakeholder transform the business model, and what you were doing was putting yourself for farmers, in that case in Rwanda, right? And then saying, how can we build together the new partnerships and new models on that? And then if we look at what happened in the Food Collective, right? The minute that you were able to get together as a value chain, now you're able to have trusted partnerships and relationships, for example, with those who are leading on the EU Green Deal, right? And then we can have conversations around saying, how can we shape this so that it really is putting farmers at the heart and the center and solving it for them from an economic perspective, to your point about who we care for. Angela, I'd love to bring you in, because you're talking about the kind of broadening out. We talk with the company and taking the responsibility on the company. And as you talked about within Burberry, leading for that across your value chain, supply chain. We talk about it as an industry, bringing together a full value chain and what then happens in terms of the trusted partnerships with regulators and civil society. I'd love to hear from your perspective now, as you've taken on the chair of Save the Children. Talk to us about what collaboration looks like when you take it out from the small group of human beings in business, and what you see as needed and necessary for collaboration with NGOs, governments, and business.
Sure. With the preface that I'm now officially 2 months on the job, and learning a tremendous amount. But the first time, Valerie, that you and Paul called and were sharing Imagine, and when I look back at my days at Apple, any retail investment we made at Apple, we would sit with the mayor in his planning department first for retail stores. And we would say, where would you like us to invest? Because we knew Apple could turn an area around, could turn a neighborhood. One Apple lease and 50 others would be done within the course of 6 months. So, wow. So I've always had that partnership, and we said it at Apple that you have to collaborate, you have to add value, or what's the point in doing it? So when you called and Paul said, it's got to be government, it's got to be business working together. Well, that's what I was used to doing at Burberry and at Apple. And then I said, but Paul, I think the NGOs have to come together as a part of that as well, because they look and I hope that eventually we will be able to do something to unite all of the NGOs, much like you've got the Fashion Pact, et cetera, because the problem has gone back 10 years because of COVID. So we all have to unite. We've got to accelerate. I mean, it's devastating. It's gone from 135 to 270 million people, massive food deprivation. And it's solvable, but to where you started, not alone for any of us. So we are working on a very transformative strategy at Save the Children. We're doing incredible work, but we're all working together now. And we're hoping within 6 months, we're going to come out with a new, and we're saying we need to partner 3 times more. We need to leverage technology 3 times more. There's an urgency here, and everybody should be outraged and should be, this is the catalyst for us to galvanize, to finally make a dent. And I don't think we should change the 2030 goals. Save the Children have their 2030 ambition. You don't move the goalpost. You move the goalpost, millions of people die. So that's not an option, but we must work differently. So I am hoping that once and for all, and my thing is, and I think companies, in the companies that I've been with, I've held us accountable. And when I joined Apple, I said, the larger the company, the greater the responsibility. We have to do more. And so I think that every company adopt an NGO. I mean, and make it a huge part of, that's the last leg of your value chain. It doesn't stop. You have got to go all the way down and help. And again, together we can do that. You have boots on the ground manufacturing things here. Save the Children has 25,000 boots on the ground helping over here. So I'm in a massive learning curve, but I do know that this is a solvable problem, and I'm incredibly excited by what we can do. And Geraldine, I'd love to learn more of what you've done, because I think there's some best practices we can share.
I'd love to bounce back if you don't mind, Valerie, but I know Patrice has joined us, so you steer this. But
no, please come on in, and then I've got a question for Patrice. Go ahead, Geraldine.
Brought me like a couple of minutes to react, because I'm fully with you, Angela. Let me give you the example that Valerie was referring to. When people think it's not possible, always ask yourself, is that really true? So we've been partnering with World Food Programme for now a couple of decades. And let's be clear, a lot of the aid, the food aid, which is provided in African countries, is imported from the US and from Europe, for the vast majority. And the big challenge was to say, why can't Africa make its own food? Made in Africa for Africa. So we actually had one of these conversations, and we said, what is actually standing in the way? So we said, well, let's partner. One of them was commitment of demand. So we worked with the World Food Programme, and we said, if we build a plant in Africa, and in this case, we built it in Rwanda, in Kigali, that is to international standards in terms of quality and everything. And we actually produced the Super Cereal Plus, which is the lifeline of millions of people who are starving. And here we're talking about starving, not just malnutrition. And if we produced it in Africa, is that possible? And we said, yes, it's very possible, but are you committed to then buy that product? Now, fast forward 5 years, we have state-of-the-art production facility in Kigali. We have, because we're sourcing, we made a commitment to source all of the raw materials, all the grain from local smallholder farmers. We're now working with 130,000 smallholder farmers who needed only one thing: certainty of demand. They needed to know they had a customer, and then they were willing to invest in drying facility, in seeds, in better practices, and they did. We're reaching 1.6 million people currently, and that's going to go up and up, unfortunately, because the demand in Ethiopia, Sudan, etc., keeps on going. And with all of that, we've quantified, and by the way, I really want to applaud here the Center for doing something like the return on sustainability investment, because that is exactly what you need to quantify. We've quantified that we created more than 1 billion in incremental value for East Africa only through this one project. So this was all about partnering with people you don't normally partner with. It's not easy to work with development banks and some of the NGOs because, of course, they have their donors, they have their constraints. But if you set your mind to it and you combine private sector can-do mentality, I have to say, there's a certain effectiveness in the private sector that can get on with things, with the commitment of non-governmental organization and, to be honest, governmental organizations, because in this case, we also had the government of Rwanda. And in these people, the 1.6 million, we're reaching a lot of children. and we're addressing malnutrition and stunting. So this is to give you one very concrete, real on the ground. And Angela, I would love to invite you to Kigali and come and see it with your own eyes.
Absolutely. I was in Kigali about 2 years ago because I'm also on the board of Charity Water, and I believe that's also where it begins. So
yeah.
I think it's interesting you say.
Thanks. Yeah. And we want to do a lot more of that, by the way. This is one, but the question is, why don't we do this times 100? Exactly. And then you can address malnutrition, you can address stunting, you can take the race forward to zero hunger. Not a well, can we do it, but really create a movement and a momentum that everyone wants to be part of it. And I think this is also, where the upcoming generation can do a lot. Because when you create a need to forward momentum, you get a lot more speed than it's finger pointing and criticism.
Yeah, exactly. And it was interesting because if you're saying, the models are out there, it's about now scale and speed. Or how do we get scale at speed? Because as Angela said, we're not moving the goalposts, people die. And that's just unacceptable for us. As humanity, we've decided it's not okay to live on a planet where people who are not born into this avatar, this body, are going to suffer just because of the lottery ticket of life, as Paul would say. We're there, and we're not okay with that anymore. We know the solutions are out there. And as Agnes was saying when she was citing Africa Improved Foods and what you guys have done, DSM, Geraldine, as an example of what kinds of things that the UN Food Summit and other kind of global convenings are saying, what are the big ideas and the big unlocks that we fundamentally rethink how we're creating value for who and over what time horizon. Patrice, love to bring you back in the conversation now that you're back with us as well. Interesting that if you think about COVID, I think when it first happened, and of course we're all in business continuity, and fashion, particularly retail, has been hit incredibly hard. And I remember fellow CEOs reaching out and saying, oh, we think sustainability is going to go out the back door as we're thinking about business continuity. That hasn't happened. Why is that? And why is this potentially a breakdown to a breakthrough for that we all needed?
I remember the same type of conversation I had with Matchett, who's the CEO of the NRF, at the beginning of the crisis, saying, are you worried that this topic will just fall down the priority list? The good news is it hasn't. If anything, it's accelerated, to your point. I think this has been a time through all the hardship for people to really re-question what matters. And really rethink what's important. And when you do that and you step back and you really think what really matters, what's important, I think every one of us has kind of gone through that self-analysis and thought process and what value am I bringing and is my energy focused on really the right thing, which I think is one of the silver linings of this incredible crisis. I think it's led a number of us to say, no, this matters. This makes a difference. This is about lives. As you and Angela were talking, right? This is meaningful, and we have a limited time on this planet, and I think we're all looking for meaning and an ability to make a difference and contribute. And this provides us, I think, a wake-up call and a time for reflection. Listen, we're dealing with a health crisis, an economic crisis, a societal crisis, social crisis, right? I mean, we got the convergence of many different challenges here, and I think that's what's happened. And what's exciting is, I think people have realized that when the water level goes up, no pun intended, all boats rise, a little bit to your earlier point, Angela. So this call to action that says, yes, we could try to do things by ourselves, but there's so much benefit, seen and unseen, of coming together. I feel the momentum building and the energy that's actually coming from that. So I think one of the silver linings, obviously our job now is to keep it going and accelerate.
Yeah, well said. One of the things that I think happened globally that I've heard a lot of people, it'd be interesting to see if this was the same for you, is that I also heard some people after the first lockdown saying, gosh, I hope we don't go back. Like if we get back on track. And I remember I was talking actually to a CEO, a woman in China who was in the fashion industry, and she said, Valerie, I'm looking out and I don't see the smog over Shanghai like I used to. And the minute that we get back on track, that means that we're going to be trying to get lives and livelihoods back together, but we're going to be sucking it from our planet. And we fundamentally need the pause to think about what is it we're doing economically, socially, and then how can we rethink it? And I think I go back to what Geraldine, you were saying at the beginning of the conversation, is about our belief and our care. Yeah. And if I go back to what Einstein said, I was thinking, Patrice, as you were talking, you can't solve a problem from the same level of consciousness that created it. So is this what this COVID moment is? We've become more conscious and we've had a space that we are all connected and we actually really do care. And you're embodying this in your leadership. My last
Valerie,
question.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I do think the landscape has changed from our stakeholders. I don't think consumers are going back, right? Their expectations have increased on this front. I don't think there's any going back. I think for our employees, and we're in touch with them, one way or another on a daily basis, this now really matters. I don't think that's going back. I think for investors, same thing. I think we're past the inflection point of this is now a very important consideration as investors decide where to put their funds. So I'm actually encouraged by the fact, I don't think there's any going back when you look at the stakeholders that encourage us, that support us, and that push us to make progress in this space.
Isn't that amazing to hear, Patrice? If you think about the conversations that we've all been in all this time, we were thinking, oh, well, if only consumers would ask for it, then we could, right? If only investors would, and Geraldine, you were CFO, right? You were leading, you were one of the founders and members of Focusing Capital on the Long Term as a platform for you now. How do you get finance? And the whole thing was if only investors would ask, if only the consumers would ask, well, who are these? These are fellow human beings. I mean, we're all consumers, we're all employees at some level. And, whether it's a lot of money or some pennies, we're probably an investor in some way. We'd hope to be. So there's that kind of humanity moment that's there too. And when I hear each of you, my last question is really around the kind of personal leadership, right? Because you say ultimately it's human beings that are the system and it's a function of our beliefs. And we can change it based on our belief. Look how fast we can shift to the norm. So my closing question for each of you before we bring Paul back in about 5 minutes is just a personal reflection on why you think personal leadership matters and the courageousness that's required from this moment as well, you as individuals. Angela.
I mean, I think as humans, regardless of the mission, it's always about leadership. And, it's funny, I use in my early days at Save the Children and in my early days at Ralph and in my early days at Apple, I've often referred to JFK and the man on the moon. And he gave a very simple edict. We'll put a man on the moon in 10 years and we'll bring him back safely. And you look back at the probability of that happening, but he put the vision out there, and then NASA, with thousands of partners, they didn't do it on their own, did the unthinkable in 9 years. And so I tend to look at if they could do that in the 60s, but that's leadership, that's vision, that's strategy, that is uniting people around doing something that no individual can do. And humans are absolutely incredible when ordinary people just together can do extraordinary things. And so it is all about leadership, and it is all about courageous leadership. And if you don't have the courage to do it, then you shouldn't be in leadership in the first place.
Well said. Geraldine, on the last food collect, thank you, Angela. Geraldine, on the last food collective call, we had Rem Koolhaas with us, also Frans Timmermans, EVP in the EU. And Rem showed that when he was talking about kind of the countryside and putting farmers at the heart, as you were saying, and he showed that image that Angela was just talking about, was the focus of human beings in the NASA control room and the attention we then had on it. Talk to us about what that attention is for us today.
Yeah, I can go there, but I would love to answer your question of how do I define courageous leadership? And I'm going to actually quote here my predecessor, whom you know very well, if I could see the smile. And he always used to say, how could you ever dare call yourself successful in a world that fails? And I think as leaders, we need to, and we have to, in the courageous one, redefine what success looks like. Success cannot be in isolation. You can have the biggest market cap, you can have whatever used to be the measuring yard for success. But the truth is, if the space that you can influence is failing, you are failing. And therefore, we need to learn as leaders now, success is not an isolated thing. Either we win together or we lose together. And we were all educated to either be rivals, to compete, or to have a supplier kind of customer relationship and know who wins and who gets the best exit. This is all over. The truth is, either we win together or we lose together. And I think as a generation, the courageous leaders are the ones who are willing to put their isolated personal success aside and realize that it is fake, it is empty. If you can't look to a bigger target, then you've missed the point.
Beautifully said. We call them courageous collectives because we believe that humans get courage in the collective at some level too. We got to win together and we got to do it for others. Patrice, last word to you before Paul comes back and joins us. Tell us about why you think personal leadership matters now.
There's probably three things I would call out. One, nothing happens without personal leadership and leadership, right? We can all look at each other waiting for the other one to move, but nothing happens without personal leadership. Second, I think the power comes through purpose and clarity of purpose, right? And I think a lot of companies have discovered as they get precise on why do they exist, what impact are they going to make on this planet, then it drives a different level of thinking, the man to the moon type of thinking. And then the last one, listen, is I think the realization leadership isn't about this single individual at the top of the mountain, screaming, follow me. It's bringing people together. It's breaking silos. It's thinking beyond, out of the box in terms of who can help, who can be an area of support. And you talked about it earlier, right? Fashion Pact is an example, NGOs. I think ultimately it's the combination of those three factors that drive progress.
Yeah, well said. Thank you, all of you, for standing for this, embodying this in so many ways. And our closing line actually was the closing line of the song Imagine that you guys all inspired as well. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. And I think that you all are embodying and holding the space that says we either win together, right, or we lose together. But the time is now, and it's not okay for us to lose together, and we're not going to, and we can reimagine the possible in that. Yeah. Thank you all for your courageous leadership. Thank you for your humility and authenticity and openness. It's not easy what each of you is doing in the spaces that you're doing it in as well. So thank you for that, because that inspires others to join us in it. Paul, welcome back. We'd like to give you some last words.
Well, I love listening in. First of all, I want to say what an amazing, insightful, and practical panel. And thanks, Valerie, for leading that so capably. Angela was talking about how far we have come, that CSR needs to be beyond box ticking, and that we need to work across all partners of the value chain, and rightfully reminded us that NGOs are part of that, a very important part. Patrice talked about the importance of purpose, of stewardship, of impact, because why do we do it all? And use the collective as an example of that in fashion. And then Geraldine talks again very eloquently, like she puts it into practice, the power of that partnership, the need to break down boundaries, the power of success cannot be done in isolation alone. That's very, very powerful. So I love what you've been doing, and obviously the hard thing is putting it into practice. What New York University of Stern is doing with the Center for Sustainability, I like actually, because Tensi and the team are trying to put it into practice. It actually starts from the premise that you explained in the panel that sustainable business is good business. And then it provides the tools and the knowledge to business leaders and others to put this into practice. We've heard from the panel that it's not easy to be a CEO these days. These are tough times. Sometimes there are decades that nothing happens, and then there are weeks that decades happen. And I think we're in one of these moments right now. We're seeing the scale of change of an industrial revolution, and we're seeing the speed of change, as Angela well knows, of a technological revolution. It is difficult to run a company, and I don't envy any of you that has to do that. We also see a clear bifurcation as a result between companies that get it and adjust and anticipate and companies that don't. Much more punishing now than at any time in history. We live in a very challenging time, and it is true that we have lifted many people out of poverty in a relatively short period of time, 500 million in the last few decades. But it is also clear to most of us that our current economic system isn't sustainable anymore. We all need to reflect not only about what we should do as businesses, but as you've heard from the panel, how we should conduct business is equally, if not more important. We live in a world where 68% of wildlife has disappeared over the last 5 decades. Some call it the 5th biggest extinction. We've seen the rainforest be cut in half, climate change out of control. And it is very clear that more people understand, as Patrice was mentioning on the panel, that anything that we can do forever is by definition not sustainable. Ultimately, it will get to the point of collapse. And I think we're starting to see some of that. I was very happy that you also brought up the issues of inequality, the farmer, the nurse, the social workers, people that actually have suffered disproportionately from COVID. 4.3 billion people in this world still live on less than $5 a day. 1.6 billion vulnerable workers. 500 million back into poverty. And I know that there are some people from the US listening, but let's not kid ourselves. If you look at the Russell 1000 companies, then you'll see that 50% of the workers weren't making enough money to support a family of 3. And that's even with their partners working part-time. That can be a healthy situation. If we want capitalism to survive, and I'm very much in that camp, we're going to have to start with stakeholder value and quantifying that. And that includes, as you've heard in the panel, both the planet as well as fellow citizens. I do believe, as well as Patrice mentioned, that we might be at a tipping point in one sense or another. COVID definitely has given us this more awareness that we are living in a failing system and has made it more transparent. Not surprisingly, 90% of the CEOs don't want to go back to where they come from. They really want to build back something better. And it's also good to remind ourselves that, frankly, before it wasn't working either. COVID has shown us this complex interrelationship between biodiversity, human health, climate change, inequality, and the economy. Ruthless as it may have been, it has been the great unequalizer once more, punishing the people that already pay disproportionately from our failings once more. But there are positive signs, as the panel has said. The first one is that ESG is now firmly on the agenda. I remember a year ago when COVID started, many people skeptical that this would be the end of ESG. It's the opposite. As was mentioned before, companies that are run very smartly on multi-stakeholder longer-term formats are performing better. Funds that are balancing the ESG and being more responsible have been blooming and perform and give returns better. Governments have actually stepped up and creating enabling environments, especially around climate, to move forward. And consumers, first and foremost, or citizens of this world, which is a better world, are demanding it now more than ever. I'm also glad again that Tensi and her team have helped us get a little bit more to the tools. The ROSI tool that has been implemented, which I think stands for Return on Sustainable Investment. It's very important that we measure. It's very important that we see that sustainable business is actually more profitable business. That is how we galvanize change. And again, I'm happy that the school has taken a leading role in that and has analyzed actually the apparel industry that Patrice is such a capable leader of. We've also seen that purpose is at the core. You cannot run a business just for your shareholders. Shareholder primacy is gone. And I would even argue if Milton Friedman would write this paper today, he'd most likely write something differently. Really, many companies are transforming totally their business models and moving from corporate social responsibility, or CSR, to becoming truly RSCs, responsible social corporations. And then the panel talked about the new demanding generation, increasingly calling for more ambition. And ambition we need to do to build back better. There are some things that align, I think, better than ever. We have now 9 out of the 10 biggest countries making climate commitments to be net zero by 2050, in line with the Paris agreements. We have the US back in the game. Multilateralism that was so absent during the crisis is starting to come back. Ngosi's appointment at the WTO, the first woman, the first person from Africa leading that organization, is good news. Now we need to ambitiously accelerate the decarbonization of our economy. And the good thing is that we're starting to see that that is an enormous source of growth, an enormous source of income generation and jobs. The Sustainable Development Goals have pointed out that just implementing in a few areas alone, mobility, health and well-being, food and land use, and cities, that we can unlock about $12 trillion of value and generate 380 million jobs. Boy, do we need them. But this is a huge business opportunity, and this is what we should talk about. But the panel also mentioned that it's not just about the environment. It's also fostering an economic and productive growth model that is based on fair wages, that is based on decent work conditions, that is based on enhanced social dialogue. This is a year of delivery. We have the COP26 in Glasgow, the COP15 on biodiversity. We have the food summit coming up that Valerie, you referred to. We really have to now not only make the long-term promises for 2050, but really put it in action now. And that's a tough challenge. And the panel has made clear that the private sector not only has a responsibility to be part of this, they would fail in a failing society, as Geraldine said, but not only a responsibility, they actually want to be active part of the solution. And I would argue that without the private sector, it wouldn't really work. So collective action is key, and this is where the panel focused on. The challenges that we have to solve are simply too significant for anybody to tackle them alone. You heard once more from the panelists the power of collective action, but also the challenges that come with it. This is not an easy game. This requires the best of all of us on how do we build these partnerships across society? How do we establish that trust? How do we hold each other accountable and responsible to the highest standards? That's one of the reasons we've created Imagine, because an increased amount of companies understand that profit should not come from creating the world's problems, but it should come from solving the world's problems. And they also understand that that needs to be done together. By putting purpose, multi-stakeholder, longer-term business models at the core of what they are doing. And purpose, obviously, is the most important thing. I think business values more and more are created around trust and responsibility, created by deep relationships that we have with all of our stakeholders, rooted in shared truths and deep values. And you saw the panel exhibiting that with the wonderful companies that they are leading. Now, the good thing is here once more that if we look at companies that are purpose-driven, pay their employees more, convert faster to green energy, have a better social contract, we can also show that they now also have better performance. But I like to end with what Angela was saying. At the end of the day, we know how to build toilets, we know how to build houses, we know how to feed people, but yet we fall terribly short. Nearly 1 billion people still going to bed hungry every night, not even knowing if they wake up the next morning. So it boils down to leadership. It boils down to willpower. And willpower itself is a renewable resource. So that's why I like it. But the principal question that we have to ask ourselves is really, do we care? Can we unlock this inner core called courage that comes from the French word cœur and starts, frankly, with the heart? Can we bring humanity and humility back to business? Can we muster it to be true leaders by putting the interest of others ahead of our own, knowing that by doing so, we're better off itself as well? And can we indeed do that with a high level of humanity and humility to form these partnerships, to think intergenerational? That is the leadership we need, and that is the leadership of purpose. The Dalai Lama said it very well when he said that if you seek enlightenment just for yourself, simply to enhance yourself in your position, you actually miss its purpose. But if you seek enlightenment for yourself to enable you to serve others, you are with purpose. I want to thank this very purposeful panel, and for all the people that are listening, lead a life with purpose. Thank you very much.
Hi, Paul and Valerie. I want to thank you both for the terrific panel, but more importantly, for the hard work that you all are doing to take us to that next level. It's so exciting to hear your collective action and passion and engagement around making the world a better place. And as you said, Paul, willpower is a renewable resource, right? And we all need that to be able to move forward in what is a very challenging time. So thank you for your vision, your collective action, and taking the time to talk with us all today. So I'm just going to take a few minutes to summarize these last 2 mornings that we've all had together, or afternoons if you're elsewhere. And first of all, again, thank our sponsors, Quintess, Invest Industrial, at Glenmead, and Harvard Business Review, our organizers, the moderators, and all the speakers. And just to sort of place in context everything that we heard, so first and foremost, the theme that we all heard throughout was, how do we embed sustainability into corporate strategy? How do we create value for all? And this question of, we've moved from the why to the why not to the how came up several times. Gillian Tett from Financial Times, Paul Polman from Imagine just brought that up. So I think all of us need to be focusing on that how. And in those conversations that we've had, for example, around sustainable investing, we heard that sustainable investing is now just investing. I mean, that is where we want to go. And that we're talking about multiple decades of revenue trends, right, in front of us related to sustainability. And that those investors not recognizing that are not going to do well. We also saw that, we also heard on our consumer panel that we're in an era where brands need to shift paradigms, not just tweak products, right? That consumers continue to drive growth in sustainably marketed products. 57% of the growth in consumer packaged goods came from sustainable products. And we're seeing that in green chemistry and carbon labeling and so on. We also heard from the industries around how they're actually learning to better track the business case for sustainability. We heard from the apparel sector, from REI, Reformation, Eileen Fisher, and their partner HSBC, together with our team working on ROSI, Return on Sustainability Investment. That in terms of that how do you track this, that there's real value to applying financial analysis to squishy things like, how does purpose drive better employee relations and retention engagement, and that issues like circularity can actually really drive financial benefit in a variety of different ways, that the companies need to get better at figuring out how to understand, aggregate, and track that data. We heard from Tim Ryan, the CEO, or the chairman of PwC, that the job of the CEO has changed. That as recently as 5 years ago, the CEO was focused on 3 constituencies, investors, employees, and customers. In some cases, more on investors than employees and customers. And that today, the CEO needs to manage for those 3 very important constituencies, but beyond that, to communities, to nonprofit organizations, and with a much bigger focus on employees. And he talked in particular about his company's focus on improving diversity and inclusion in the company, and how to go about that through, first and foremost, really having the data at a very deep level about what your current situation is, building that culture, and ensuring transparency around what you're doing. He also talked about the need to sort of upskill boards to really prepare them, as shown by our research, for this new world. Another area we heard about on the technology side was sort of the enabling, that technology can provide the enabling conditions for this for these changes that we need to see. We heard that, technology can help us provide accessible and affordable health care. It can provide access to credit for underserved communities. It can help bring climate resiliency to cities, but that it can also create challenges, that it's not a panacea, that just throwing technology at a problem could actually make it worse. It needs guidelines. And one example we heard is that technologists focus on, making better cities, work better if they're going to work with urbanists who really understand urban planning and bring those two skills together in, as we heard from Imagine, a more collective and collaborative approach. And finally, in our Imagine discussion, Imagining a Better World, we heard from Patrice that, the hardship that we've all gone through this past year has helped us to question what really matters. What is our purpose? And that from his perspective, embedded sustainability is key. And I love this analogy that it's like electricity, right? It surrounds us, it powers us. We half the time don't even notice it's there, but it's critical to our survival, as we've seen in Texas. Hopefully we're talking about renewable electricity. And that, we're past the inflection point. And we heard from Geraldine and Angela that this is sustainable business is good business. This is about leadership. This is about really making sure that you're supporting and engaging the people in your value chain. Geraldine talked about the farmer is the hero. And how do we make it possible for the farmer through, for example, long-term contracts to actually make the investments around sustainability that we need to see? And then finally, Paul is the best sort of person to wrap things up. So it's sort of quoting from him. I'm stealing from a master, but he said there are weeks when decades happen, and I'll add to that and say that when you look at history, you often can't tell that you're in a point when everything changes until afterwards, right? And so for many of us who've been working on this for years, we feel like we're still pushing the boulder up the hill, and we still are to a certain extent. We have a lot to solve, a lot of challenges, but we are seeing change happen rapidly around these topics. It is the moment for real leadership, for transformation. COVID has created these massive inequalities that Paul talked about, and really all of you working on how we create corporate leadership in a way that actually supports humanity, supports the environment, and ultimately, of course, supports the profitability of the companies that you lead, but doing it in a way that really enables support for all of our constituencies. And I would underscore employees, because I think that's been an area where we've really not done the type of job that we need to. So with all that, I want to thank you. I want to ask you to please reach out to us at NYU Stern Center for Sustainable Business. If you'd like to partner with us in terms of students, in terms of research, please do visit our website. We will be sharing the recordings from all the sessions in case you weren't able to make them all. And again, I want to thank you for participating. And again, thank our team for creating a great 2 days. Thank you so much.